So I want to kick this whole thing off with a fun topic that is definitely going to get people going and probably cause some disagreements and arguments, and that's fine. But I'm going to try to do it in a way that maybe makes a little more sense on paper and isn't just so rant and rave of the millennial, right? And yes, I'm a millennial, so I apologize if you liked me before. I understand. I understand. But let me walk you through this first before you totally write me off, okay? So I'm going to dive in here, and I've obviously got some charts and things, and I'm going to try to make it a little more interesting than the boringness of this. But starting in 1970, and I picked 1970 because the baby boomer generation born in, call it the 50s, right? That's when my parents were born. They're part of the baby boomer generation. In the 70s was when they were really turning 20, moving out of the house, buying their first house, buying cars, getting jobs, doing all that stuff. So they're in the position that millennials have been complaining about being in now for a while, right? So 1970, and this data, by the way, comes from Fred, the St. Louis Fed, and the Consumer Affairs Journal of Research. So pretty good sources. You can feel free to Google them and do whatever you want, but argue with me about them. I don't care. Anyway, 1970 was also the last time that we saw income and housing prices on par, right? So they're level with each other here. And that's important because as we move forward, then what we can say is every shift that happens, if houses get more expensive but income follows it, that's fine. They're still on par. But when we jump forward to today, and I mean, you watch it just immediately happen, right? The housing price now has gone up 13 times, almost 14 times. So while we are a generation making more money than all of the prior generations, we have exponentially higher costs. So the finance books that you would read that were written back in the 70s and 80s and whatever would all say, well, as a percentage of income, your housing costs to include your utilities should be 25 to 35%. So what you could do back then was get a good average house where now you can't afford an average house. The average mortgage payment on a house today blows that $60,000 out of the water, especially when you take out taxes and all the other things, right? And that's what the millennials are really complaining about is the cost exponentialized and income didn't exponentialize. So I get it that we're making more money than you, but we have to spend exponentially more money than you in this 25 to 35% range. Doesn't make any sense. The base number is 30%, and then I've got to tack on utilities and maintenance and everything else, and I'm looking at 50, 60% of my income going to a house, which I was told I was supposed to do by the generation that when they were buying houses were the same amount as their annual income, right? And then I went down and I pulled some other stats just so that we could get some comparisons, right? Tuition. Obviously, everyone's talking about student loans, the student loan crisis, forgiving student loans, and the older generations are saying, why on earth would we forgive you? You took out the loan, you should be responsible for it, and I totally agree. Also, back in the time when they were going to school, tuition was a lot lower. Now it's gone up 26 times. So as a percentage of income and as an amount that you're taking a loan out on when you're a kid who can at best work a summer job, it doesn't make the same sense. You can't go, and this is, by the way, this tuition number is not the total cost of attendance. It doesn't include housing. It doesn't include your fees and books and everything else. This is just tuition. And you can Google it. And it's gone up 26 times, which is why I have the two charts down there, because when you put the housing chart up there, $400,000 just blows the rest of the chart out of the water and you can't really see anything. So putting it on a percentage of change, you see where student loans went way up, and on that percentage of change chart, the very bottom line, all the way down there at the bottom with the least amount of change, is income. Everything else went up. So what we were taught as kids growing up by a generation that lived in a very different world doesn't work anymore. And we don't know what to do, right? No one can teach us how to handle this, or no one is teaching us how to handle this situation. They're teaching us what we should have done back in 1970 or the 2000s. And it doesn't work the same. That's what we're really complaining about. But this is what I think is interesting, okay? Money is completely made up by people. We invented money as an exchange of goods and whatever. So that's not necessarily built into our DNA, right? But survival is. And that's where I think this starts to really get interesting. When we look at all these numbers and you go, okay, so housing prices have gone way up, tuition's gone way up. So maybe I don't go to college, but then to go to college, I need to go to college to be able to get the good job, to be able to afford the house, to do this, that, and the other thing. But what if I figured out a way to cut that housing cost way down? And then we invented tiny houses, container homes, and all of that stuff. It is a fancy word for trailer home. I love tiny houses, but a tiny house park is just a trailer park that looks nicer. And we did that to survive, to cut the cost of a mortgage way back down to where our parents said it should be, based on math that happened when they were buying their houses. We're going to find a way to survive. We can work different separate jobs. We can live out of a Sprinter van and drive around the country and do what we want. And life can look totally different because now I can hook up, internet to the van and work a remote job. And they couldn't do that, right? So we have the technology. They gave us the technology and the means to figure it out. But we have to figure it out in a very different way. And that to me is where it's really interesting. When you think about the future, and if you're an investor, if you're thinking about investing and what that's going to look like moving forward, to me, you got to look at how are they going to survive? How are the kids going to take this math problem that doesn't make sense for them and adjust it to survive? Are they going to crash the housing market? I mean, that would get the numbers back in line, I guess. Or are they going to live in a tiny house or out of a van or do something because accommodations can get more comfortable like that? And they don't need to stay in one place anymore. They don't need to go to the office every day because we have the internet, right? And so that's where I think this gets really fascinating. But at the root of it, what millennials are complaining about is that the math doesn't make sense and we have to figure out a different way to survive. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was informational for you. Hopefully you're not too mad at me. But also I want you to think about this math problem, and all we're doing is trying to survive at this point. And hopefully thrive, retire, all that fun stuff. Anyways, have a good day.